Hello all, I am Syr Konrad, Knight of Lochthwain and Keeper of the Graves. It is my pleasure to make your acquaintance. I will be giving you a personal tour of my graveyard, the place where I prefer to spend most of my time. The graves provide a wonderful home for many, and there's no place like our own graveyard to cultivate that home. Come along now, don't straggle, as you never know what creatures might emerge from the damp earth. Welcome, Crusaders, to the grim graveyard. Still here, eh? Well then let us begin. What is the goal of this deck, you might ask? Well, first, let's take a look at what I can do. For 5 mana, I provide you with a 5/4 body of a human knight. Whenever another creature dies or is put into the graveyard from anywhere, I deal 1 damage to each of our opponents. Additionally, whenever a creature card leaves our graveyard, I deal 1 damage to each opponent. Also, for 1 and a black, I can have each player mill the top card of their library into their graveyard, pinging each opponent for each creature milled this way. This deck will be focused more on filling our own graveyard and toying with the creature count inside of it. The first thing we'll need to look at then is how will we fill our graveyard. Let us start with the creatures. The synergy that they provide by filling our graveyard is valuable in many ways. Balustrade Spy can dig a good chunk into our deck by having us mill until we hit a land. Crow of Dark Tidings, Extractor Demon, and Wailing Ghoul all mill us for 2 as they enter the battlefield. Also, if Extractor Demon enters the graveyard, we can unearth it for 3 mana. Necromancer's Assistant, Stitch's Supplier, and Windgrace Acolyte mill us for 3 as they enter, while Returned Reveler and Stitch's Supplier do the same when they die. Forsaken Drifters mills us for 4 when they die, while Gorging Vulture, Mindwrack Demon, and Returned Centaur mill us for 4 as they enter the battlefield. Middlekin taps for a colorless, and when it does, it mills us for 1. Finally, Stinkweed Imp and Golgari Thug each have Dredge. As long as Stinkweed Imp is in our graveyard, we can mill 5 instead of drawing a card, bringing Stinkweed Imp back to our hand. As long as Golgari Thug is in our graveyard, we can do the same, but for 4. Lastly, Sewer Nemesis has us choose a player as it enters the battlefield. Normally, it'll be ourselves. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in that player's graveyard, and any time they cast a spell, that player will mill that top card. Many of these enter the battlefield creatures are affected well by Panharmonicon, an optional include for the deck, but one to think about. Remember, every single time a creature enters or leaves our graveyard, our opponents are taking 1 as long as I am in the battlefield. As long as our opponents are suffering, that is never a bad thing. Now let's talk about artifacts, instants, and sorceries that help us fill our graveyard. Let us begin with the artifacts. Altar of Dementia will allow us to sacrifice our creatures and keep our mill plan going. Ghoul Caller's Bell taps to have every player mill 1. Worry Beads causes each player to mill 1 card at their upkeep, disrupting their plans and fueling our own. Grind Clock is a great early drop to start milling ourselves or an opponent. We can tap it to add a charge counter, or we can tap it to have somebody mill for the amount of counters on the artifact. Keening Stone can cause a huge number of creatures to hit our grave very quickly. By paying 5 mana, we can tap it, and we can have target player mill cards equal to the number of cards in their graveyard, essentially doubling the size of it. Finally, we have 2 heavy hitters in the deck, Mesmeric Orb and Mind Crank. Mesmeric Orb states that when a player untaps a permanent, they mill 1 card. This includes all lands, creatures, artifacts, and anything else they might untap on their turn. It is often stated that Mind Crank is my most important artifact, and to this I cannot deny. Whenever a player other than us takes damage, they will mill cards equal to the damage dealt to them. This means when I trigger and deal 1 damage to each opponent then mills 1 card off the top of their library. For each creature milled this way, another trigger of mine goes on the stack. Each time I trigger, each opponent mills one and takes one. This will only stop if we move through each of my triggers one by one until they are all off the stack, and each opponent has not milled a single creature. Quite a disgusting interaction, yes, but effective. Moving on to sorceries. Dread Summons causes mass hysteria as it hits the stack. For X black and a black, each player puts the top X cards of their library into their graveyard, and we make a 2/2 zombie for each creature milled this way. Not only will I deal damage to our opponents, but will also create a 2/2 army of ghastly ghouls to beat them down. Liliana's indignation causes only us to mill X, but every time a creature hits our graveyard from this spell, target opponent will lose 2 life. Finally, let's talk about my favorite card in this deck, Morality Shift. Morality Shift is a 7-mana sorcery that says we swap our library and our graveyard. What this means in our deck is that our opponents will take 1 damage for each creature we've slotted into our deck that isn't already on the battlefield. In total, this deck is running 38 creatures. If none of them are on the battlefield and they're all in the library or the graveyard, Morality Shift will read 7 mana. Each opponent takes 38 damage. Isn't that wonderful? Now you may be asking yourself, but Syr Konrad, what if someone exiles our graveyard? And to that I say, be silent, simpleton. Allow me to explain. We are running 6 ways of shuffling our graveyard back into our library, 3 of which are repeatable effects. The first 3 are Cranial Archive, Felden's Cane, and Thran Foundry. They will all allow us to shuffle our graveyard into our library at instant speed. Elixir of Immortality does the same, but we also gain 5 life, and it shuffles itself into the deck. Finally, we have 2 creatures that shuffle in on entry to our graveyard. Ulamog, the Infinite Gyre, and Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. Both will shuffle our graveyards back into our library, if they enter for any reason. If either of them are stuck in our hand and we need to shuffle our graveyard in urgently, we can use our trusty Deal Broker or Medicine Bag to get them into the graveyard where they belong. If all else fails, our backup plan is simple. It's called No Brooch. No Brooch is a 4-mana artifact that allows us to pay 2 mana to counter any non-creature spell. The only drawback? We have to discard our entire hand. This is a repeatable effect though. Even if we don't have a hand, we can activate the brooch to counter a non-creature spell. Okay, but Syr Konrad, what if someone destroys you? Doesn't the deck just not work anymore? Silence, oaf. I have thought of every hypothetical scenario. To protect myself, we're bringing along Darksteel Plate, Swiftfoot Boots, and Medicine Bag. These artifacts allow me to be indestructible, hexproof, or in Medicine Bag's case, the ability to regenerate. Although a little peasantish, they will have to do. Death, though, is inevitable, so we've planned for this eventuality as well. Barrow Witches allows us to bring a knight, me, from our graveyard back to our hand. Cadaver Imp, Gravedigger, Grave Scrabbler, and Order of Midnight do the same, but for any creature. Pit Keeper helps us with a similar effect as long as we have a full graveyard. Hakan, one of my best friends, can only be cast from our graveyard, but as long as he's in play, we can play any of our night spells from our graveyard. This includes me. Haunted Crossroads is an enchantment that gives us a top-of-the-library effect for 1 black mana, and it's repeatable. Forever Young is a sorcery that will allow us to put any number of creatures on top of our library and draw a card. Fated Return will bring me back with indestructibility from our graveyard. Wake the Dead is an instant for X, black and a black, that will allow me and a few other creatures to make our timely return, even for just a moment. At the end of the turn, we will all die, but I will see all of their death triggers. Finally, Liliana Death's Majesty, the only planeswalker in the deck, will bring us back with her minus ability. She continues to synergize well with her plus ability, which allows us to mill 2. In the end, no plan is foolproof, and I may end up in the command zone. That is where the extra mana from Songs of the Damned, Solemn Simulacrum, Leaden Mirror, Cryptghast, and Cabal Coffers comes into play. If we're ever running low on life, Black Lance Paragon can give me lifelink until end of turn during a big Mind Crank trigger, or maybe right before a Morality Shift resolves. For troublesome creatures, we're running Cavalier of Night and Shriekmaw to destroy what ails us. When we're running low on cards in our hand, Corpse Augur, Siphon Mind, and the pesky Rankle Master of Pranks will allow us to fill up our hands and shrink down our opponents. Speaking of opponents, as those graveyards grow, they might contain some scary threats. To rid them, we're running Bojuka Bog. Also, to punish strategies who like milling themselves, we're running Bloodchief Ascension. For 1 black, it's an enchantment that says if an opponent lost 2 or more life, at the end step put a quest counter on it. As long as there are 3 quest counters on Bloodchief Ascension, any time a card enters an opponent's graveyard, they will lose 2 life and we will gain 2 life. This is not a card to make friends at your local game store. Finally, Corpse Connoisseur can find us Hakan for our graveyard so we can cast him. It can also find us an Eldrazi in case we need to shuffle in a graveyard of 50 cards back into our library. As a last little piece of tech, since we aren't running any mass reanimation spells, we're putting a fun creature in the 99. Its name is Leveler, and it's here to punish anyone who wants to grave rob the beautiful yards we filled up during the course of the game. Leveler says as it enters the battlefield, exile your library. That means that if somebody casts a Rise of the Dark Realms, they will be punished to the greatest extent of my power. Oh yes, that will teach them for scrounging where they don't belong. I do hope that you've enjoyed this little tour between the tombstones. And remember, the dead are always watching.